How ships move through the water is something that has seen a huge amount of development in a relatively small amount of time compared to how long ships have been around. Up until less than 200 years ago, ocean-going ships at least had, for millennia, generally used either oars, sails, or a combination of the two in order to get around. The story of these means of propulsion is something for another time, but during the first half of the 19th century, two new kinds of propulsion came into widespread circulation to make use of the steam engine, which by this point was beginning to be deployed at sea. Of course, it would take some time for the steam engine to become efficient enough to be the sole means of propulsion, and longer still for it to catch on in all aspects of the maritime world, with some merchant vessels remaining purely sail-powered until the early part of the 20th century, in areas where access to fuel was restricted. But the purpose of this video is to give an insight into the development and deployment of the two propulsion methods, the paddle wheel and the screw propeller, starting from their surprisingly early origins well before the steam engine popularised their use across the planet. So, although the earliest extant evidence for the use of screw propellers to move water goes back over 2,000 years, their association with moving water to move a ship comes much later. So we're going to look at paddle wheels first. At its core, a paddle wheel consists of a central drive shaft laid perpendicular to the intended direction of advance and installed generally above the waterline. To this are attached a series of paddle blades that can be of varying design. This can be as simple as a series of planks of wood, fitted like the spokes of a land-based wheel, to a set of repurposed oars, or in later times, something far more complex and with many moving parts. The principle, though, is simple. With a set of oars, you have a certain amount of thrust generated as the oar blade passes through the water, but as the oar is raised to be reset to its entry position, you now no longer have any thrust, and the ship will immediately begin to slow. Plus, technically, there's a small amount of force pushing the ship back from the energy expended relocating the oar thanks to Newton's third law of motion. As such, every oar stroke expends a certain amount of energy simply building the ship's speed back up to whatever speed the previous stroke had achieved at its maximum power output, and this somewhat limits the top speed of a given hull if it's using oar propulsion. Conversely, a paddle wheel, in its simplest form, could be thought of as an infinite series of oars being pushed through the water one after the other. The gap between individual blades starting to provide thrust is massively reduced, and typically there are several blades providing propulsion all at once. There's obviously still some energy lost in the blades being brought back around and over to get into the water again, but this is relatively small. The production of essentially continuous thrust allows ships to achieve significantly higher top speeds for a given hull form than a directly oar-powered equivalent for the same energy expended, or you can get a similar top speed for less energy. In many ways, the paddle wheel drive is simply inverting the much older technology of the water wheel mill, where energy is taken from the water to drive a shaft. The issue is how to power the paddle wheels prior to the invention of something like the steam engine. The first solid mention of a solution to this appears to be from a 4th century AD book, De Rebus Bellicus, which records,
I shall, in fact, demonstrate how a particularly fast type of warship is able through a brilliant invention to outmatch 10 other ships, sending them to the bottom without the aid of a large crew. A Liburnian ship suitable for naval warfare, so large that human weakness more or less precluded its being operated by men's hands, is propelled in any required direction by animal power, harnessed by the aid of human ingenuity to provide easy locomotion. Inside its hull or hold, pairs of oxen are yoked to the machines and turnwheels attached to the ship's sides. The spokes project beyond the circumference or rim of the wheels and, striking the water forcibly like oars as the wheels rotate, work with a wondrous and ingenious effect, their impetus producing locomotion. Moreover, this warship, thanks to its massiveness and the machines working inside it, joins battle with such furious strength that it easily crushes and destroys all opposing warships that come to close quarters with it. But if the enemy flees the land and besets the seas with naval warfare, victory will be restored to you without delay by a warship swiftly traversing the waves by means of a new speed device, for it is propelled by wheels and oxen as though it were on land. For who will resist its strength when it has the firmness of a land vehicle and has the advantage of a ship's easy movement?
Needless to say, over the years this account has caused a fair bit of argument between those who say it's just something someone made up at the time, and others who claim that it was entirely plausible. From my perspective as an engineer, the basic system of paddle wheel, drive shaft and gearing to change the direction of rotation was already well established in the Roman Empire, as mentioned earlier, for the use of grinding grain, the sawing of wood, and the raising of water, the latter sometimes using, of all things, an Archimedes screw. So simply flipping over input and output is not exactly difficult to comprehend, and indeed such systems, powered by livestock, pop up time and again throughout history. Even within recent memory, as discussed in the paper that's linked to it below in the video description, a 19th century version of this exact drive method was recorded thus.
At Yarmouth, the horse packet is about 60 feet in length and 18 feet abeam. It is worked by 4 horses in a file, which walk in a circle 18 feet in diameter, in which they are much too confined, and so do only half the work. The drive shaft has 2 beveled wheels, one at each end, by which the motion is communicated from the horses to the axle of the paddle wheels 7 feet in diameter. The boat goes at the rate of about 6 miles an hour.
However, this kind of system faces a number of issues. The development of the paddle wheel itself can affect how fast the ship can go. A wider paddle blade will obviously generate more force, but this ties back to the power source itself. A horse, ox, or some men can only exert so much force, so it would then become a race between the beam of the ship, and thus the number of creatures attached to the rotation arm, and of course the increasing moment of force they could generate, versus the increasing size and displacement of the ship, which would cancel out some or potentially all of those gains. Then you also have the fact that most animals are not quite so keen on walking on a almost constantly pitching surface, and of course they also don't have infinite energy, which would require you to have multiple teams of animals and/or an alternate means of propulsion such as sails, for when whatever you're using to drive the mechanism happens to need a rest. As a result, these muscle-driven paddle systems didn't really catch on in subsequent centuries over in the West, but the next historical reference to them is found in the following century over in China. Here, the use of human power instead of domestic animals and the extensive river network in China seems to have led to a series of human-powered paddle wheel vessels being built, starting in the 400s and progressing via a series of different mechanisms. Seeming to settle on the treadmill as the ideal way to convert human walking power into rotational energy, these ships would see service alongside what we might think of as more conventionally powered vessels for over 1,000 years. Although humans are somewhat more adaptable compared to domestic animals, we are individually weaker in terms of power output than the typical horse or ox is. And this, combined with what seems to be the use of treadmills in a more direct drive system, appears to have limited the overall power output of the Chinese paddle wheel system, with larger or faster vessels simply adding more small paddle wheels as opposed to just making a single set of paddle wheels much larger, which would be possible with gearing, especially if multi-person treadmills were used. However, I do not have enough information about the precise details of this particular system to make a full judgment on potential unused methods of improvement, or indeed if they were experimented with. Back over in the West, there seems to have been periodic rediscoveries of the paddle wheel idea, often at this point using crankshafts to drive them. with a switch broadly to human power, a bit similar to the Chinese, although as time went on, small river ferries using literal horsepower became more common as the technology as a whole proliferated much later on, much as we've had narrated earlier. In the 16th century, there were even a few Spanish ships that were built using human-powered paddle wheels for ocean-going work. The inventor, Don Blasco de Garay, had captained vessels before and managed to persuade the Spanish crown to fund some experimental conversions. These must have used either independently driven paddle wheels or else some kind of detachable linkage on the drive shafts, as they were noted, amongst other things, for their exceptional agility in calm waters, pretty much certainly due to the capability of reversing one wheel whilst the other one kept going forward. Some claim that these demonstration ships were steam-driven as well, but generally this doesn't seem to be accepted amongst various scholars, and indeed the reported speed of the test vessel is more in line with what you would reasonably expect from a human-powered vessel. However, the paddle steamer was not far off. Over the course of the 18th century, there were multiple attempts, many successful, at construction of a paddle vessel, driven with the newly invented steam engines. But the large size, hilarious inefficiency, and horrendous reliability of early steam engines scuppered every attempt during this time period to make them commercially viable. It would therefore not be until the 19th century, albeit only just, that commercial steam-powered paddle vessels began to appear. The usual argument being over if the honour should go to the Scottish Charlotte Dundas, which was built to haul barges along rivers and chronologically is the first of the two candidates, and demonstrated a successful operation in 1802, but did not continue in service, but this was due to other concerns over issues like the erosion of the banks by the wash of the ship, rather than whether or not the ship was a commercially viable platform in and of itself. The other candidate is the American North River Steamboat, also colloquially known as the Claremont, of 1807, which managed to definitively run a commercially successful service with passengers running up and down the Hudson River. Soon after this, as steam engines began a rapid series of improvements, paddle wheels began to be deployed on seagoing warships, starting in the 1820s, although there were some commercial paddle-driven tugs that were built even before this. However, as indicated earlier, the efficiency of steam engines in this period was not great, and so oceanic vessels still needed to be dual-powered, using sails as well as steam. This, in part, drove a series of innovations in paddle wheel technology, since inert paddle wheels, particularly if they were locked up and even if they were allowed to freely rotate, created quite substantial drag, and of course imposed additional weight limits on ships, which would reduce their capability under sail. As such, systems were developed to allow individual paddle blades, or floats, to be removed when the drive was not in use, to minimise these drag effects. Other innovations included the Morgan system, which introduced limited arc pivots on the floats, which meant that the system became a little bit more efficient, as the float would now face perpendicular to the water through the entire period of its travel underwater, and this would also allow almost all water to slide off the float the moment it emerged, albeit all at the cost of a slightly heavier and more maintenance-intensive wheel as a whole. Paddle wheels could also be placed directly aft, the famous stern wheelers on the USA's internal river system being perhaps the most notable, if not the exclusive, examples of this kind of drive system. All in all, paddles offered a number of significant advantages over sail power. They could, of course, drive the ship against the wind, or in no wind at all. If you could drive the wheels in opposite directions, then you could essentially turn on the spot, which was invaluable for confined waters such as harbours and rivers. The piercing of the hull for the drive shaft was above the waterline, which meant it was no more dangerous to the watertight integrity of the ship than a gun port was. Broken paddle floats turned out to generally be fairly easy to replace, as they were simply flat plates of iron or planks of wood, and so if they were damaged or destroyed, you could put a new one on pretty comfortably as long as the overall wheel structure itself wasn't too badly warped. and a number of floats could be lost without massively compromising the ship's ability to move about in any case. Now, as mentioned earlier, thanks to other technological innovations, you could either feather or remove the floats for progress under sail, and the paddle wheels could be sized so as not to run any deeper than the ship's keel, which made the ships ideal for shallow water operations. But there were a number of downsides as well. Travel at any great speed threw up large amounts of water, which, along with other factors, necessitated paddle boxes, which meant the overall weight of a pair of paddle wheels and their boxes, not to mention the engines, was quite substantial. Their bulk on either side of the ship made boarding actions more difficult, although if your navy was primarily defensively minded, this might actually be seen as a plus. The space taken up on each side occupied a large area of the ship's broadside which was previously devoted to guns, thus reducing the ship's potential firepower even more than the additional weight of the engines and the drive systems already had. The position of the drive shaft meant that a good portion of the ship's propulsion system had to be exposed above the waterline and thus could be easily damaged by incoming fire. If the ship was rolling heavily, a wheel might come out of the water partially or even wholly, whilst its counterpart sank even deeper into the sea, which would produce significant differential torsion on the drive shafts. Likewise, as the ship used fuel, food, water, and other supplies, the draft of the ship, and thus the amount of the paddles that were submerged, would vary, and this in turn would affect the performance of the system. There was also some concern at the time that gunfire might quite easily destroy the paddle floats, or the wheel as a whole, crippling the ship's ability to manoeuvre in the middle of a firefight, although in practice it turned out that for all their overall bulk, the relatively low-density network of spindles and beams was actually quite difficult to score a direct hit on, and remarkably redundant even if it did take an impact or two, somewhat similar to the Luftwaffe's persistent but generally frustrated attempts to bomb the chain-home radar towers during the Battle of Britain. As a result of the downsides, the paddle steamer as a warship only lasted a few decades, being largely replaced by the screw-powered vessel, except for tugs and other military but non-frontline duties, by the start of the second half of the 19th century. Since most of the major issues lay in the paddle ship's ability to fight, paddle-powered ships remained in service in the civilian world for much, much longer, which meant that during World War I and World War II, not only were some requisitioned into military service, but some of their more unique characteristics even saw brief revivals of the paddle type as minesweepers, thanks to their good shallow draft capabilities, whilst other paddle ships were used as anti-aircraft vessels defending harbours, in part again thanks to their great agility, and occasionally as emergency transports, often for evacuations, once again their shallow draft capability standing them in good stead during operations such as the Dunkirk evacuation. And of course, 2 paddle steamers were converted on the Great Lakes in World War II to create a pair of training aircraft carriers, USS Wolverine and USS Sable. The system that replaced the paddle wheel on warships, the screw propeller, had a much later start as a means of propulsion, despite the principle of using a screw to move water being famously invented, or at least popularised, by Archimedes in the 3rd century BC. Indeed, it would be approximately 2,000 years before any serious attempts to use a propeller as a means to drive a ship appears to have been recorded, with Robert Hooke, more typically remembered for his work in materials science, proposing a 4-bladed system based on windmill sails in the late 17th century. However, this does not appear to have progressed further than the drawing board owing to the lack of a suitable power plant and 2 other major issues. Due to the need to be fully submerged, a propeller system needed a drive shaft that pierced the hull underwater, a notable weakness, and because the blades drove the water directly backwards whilst remaining submerged, anytime the system was not in use, the entire surface area of the propeller would exert significant drag on a ship that might be otherwise attempting to use sails to move around. As such, it would be more than half a century before the propeller showed up again, this time in the middle of the 18th century, when the French Academy of Sciences launched a competition aimed on improving naval architecture generally. This led to a number of important submissions. Bourne, another famous scientist, apart from the naval propulsion field, although in this case he is at least significantly associated with fluid dynamics, offered up a propeller which used many spokes with heavily inclined square blades positioned at the ends. This is in principle similar to some computer cooling fans that are in use today. Another entry by Portant, a French mathematician, utilised a shortened version of the Archimedes screw, reduced to one full turn, as an alternative. A couple of decades later, the propeller appears again briefly as the main, and human-powered, drive system in the story of the submarine Turtle and its unsuccessful attempt to destroy the British warship HMS Eagle during the American War of Independence. After this, various experiments made with above and underwater driveshaft systems generally didn't get much further than the drawing board and occasionally a bit of experimentation. Much like the paddle wheel, the propeller really came into its own in the first half of the 19th century, although it did take a bit longer. The 1820s and 1830s not only saw further experiments with various forms of regular propeller, but also attempts at contra-rotating propellers, partially in an attempt to deal with the torque that a single-direction propeller could impart to a small craft, which could cause them to steadily veer off of course, as during this period, even on larger ships, generally a single screw was under consideration. Towards the end of this time period, various types of screw propeller were beginning to be used in the civilian world as alternatives to the paddle wheel for auxiliary propulsion. As well as not being subject to most of the drawbacks of paddles, the lack of deck space occupation or amidships hull space occupation made propellers rather attractive for cargo vessels who had a desire to maximise the use of valuable hull volume. A couple of developments now rapidly accelerated the propeller's cause. Firstly, the position of the screw was moved from astern of the rudder, which caused problems for both steering and water flow to the screws, to between the stem of the ship and the rudder, which greatly improved both of these issues. Propeller designs at this point were split between Bernoulli-derived units with many small blades some distance from the central shaft, and the Archimedes types. However, the Archimedean types tended to use one or more complete rotations. That is, until an experimental vessel in a London canal, piloted by Francis Petit Smith, which was using a two-rotation Archimedean screw, hit an obstacle which caused half the propeller to fall off. Reduced to a single-rotation screw, the craft immediately accelerated. This prompted a series of developments, with Smith himself not just accepting a single-rotation propeller, but moving on to one with a pair of threads that each went one half rotation around the drive shaft, what we today might call a two-bladed screw. Smith's results persuaded the Admiralty to invest in screw propellers in principle, with his experimental ship, the Archimedes, being lent to Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who used it to test various kinds of propellers, and then took the results over to persuade the backers of his new ship, the SS Great Britain, to switch from paddle to screw propulsion. The late 1830s and early 1840s saw a series of even more rapid improvements. The Archimedean type rapidly beginning to shorten as it was appreciated that better results were achieved with multiple blades, each of which would in theory make a full screw if continued, whilst the windmill style, where the blade was held away from the shaft by a non-propelling arm, also began to rapidly improve, with the arm itself gradually becoming part of the propulsion system. A variant of this can be seen on the SS Great Britain today in the replica of her original, albeit not terribly successful, propeller. Further, on both types of propeller, the variability of the pitch along the length of each blade was being experimented with, the effective overall pitch of propeller blades by the mid-1840s becoming pretty similar to that used on most propellers these days. Without computer modelling, though, practical testing was the only way forward, and so during the 1840s you'll find many accounts of ships from the Archimedes through to the famous HMS Rattler testing dozens of different propellers to try and work out which gave the best results. Of course, it was also during this period, specifically in spring 1845, that you saw the famous contest between the Rattler and her half-sister Alecto, which was a series of sailing and towing trials of which the famous tug of war was simply one part. By this point, though, the Admiralty was already pretty convinced of the screw propeller's advantages in most fields, the only real downsides being the need to pierce the hull below the waterline and the significant drag when the propeller was stopped. The latter had a number of solutions rapidly invented, which included the lifting propeller, which was hauled up into the ship when it wasn't in use, and the auto-feathering propeller, which rotated the blades to present minimal resistance and was overall a better solution than the additional weight and space that was needed to detach and raise the entire propeller. By 1860, the introduction of the conical propeller boss, rounded tips at the edges of the blades, and a generally increasing width of blade from base to tip gave us a propeller form that is still quite typical of what we would see these days on standard propellers. Exactly how many blades and what size they should be would be something of a matter of discussion for many decades hence, but the rule of thumb was that a 2 or 3 bladed propeller was generally held to be the best, with more blades being added if special circumstances prevailed. The latter part of the 19th century also saw the development of variable pitch propellers and what are referred to as built-up propellers, where the blades are made separately and then bolted on to a central boss. This made repairs much easier, as damage to one blade did not necessarily mean you had to replace the entire thing. By the start of the 20th century, a reversible propeller had been invented, which was an option for ships that didn't want to, or couldn't, reverse their engines. One final challenge awaited propeller designers, who'd spent the latter half of the 19th century tweaking things for efficiency. With the advent of the steam turbine, it was found that suddenly propellers were being spun at extremely high speeds. This created cavitation. Briefly speaking, cavitation is when the pressure of a given volume of water drops very rapidly, usually because a propeller blade has just moved through the area, or is moving through the area as the cavitation occurs. This causes the water to vaporize, which creates a void. But as the source of low pressure, in this case, as we said, the fast-moving propeller blade edge, moves away, the higher pressures surrounding the void impose themselves and collapse it rather rapidly. As the bubble implodes, it heats up, and this causes a shock wave. This can sometimes be enough to re-expand the void somewhat and set off a series of diminishing but repeating cycles. The released energy can cause incredible damage relative to the size of the cavitation bubble, and also reduces the efficiency of the propeller. At first, in early turbine-powered destroyers, attempts were made to overcome this by placing a number of separate propellers along the same shaft, and then just replacing them as they wore out. But eventually, geared turbines would reduce the revolutions per minute to a more sensible level, and ships could go back to one prop per shaft. Now, with that said, as ships then continued to grow in size and speed, cavitation would come back to assert itself, and a whole new wave of propeller development kicked off as various scientists tried to design refined blade layouts which reduced or delayed the onset of cavitation, an effort which continued through World War I, the interwar period, World War II, and still is ongoing today, with varying degrees of success. So that's a brief summary of the paddle wheel and the screw propeller, the two main forms of ship's propulsion during the time period the channel covers that aren't oars or sails. Hope you've enjoyed it, and hope to see you again in another video soon.